The cold wind whipped across the cemetery as David Miller stood frozen before the headstone. It was a modest slab of gray granite with a name etched so deeply it seemed carved into his own chest. Rachel Miller, beloved wife, taken too soon. 7 years had passed since that day, but in David's memory it remained as sharp and unforgiving as a knife wound. The pastor's voice had trembled as he spoke. The choir had sung half-hearted hymns, and the mourners had shuffled their feet in the wet grass. Yet all David could hear was the relentless echo of his own heartbeat, thudding like a drum against his ribs. He remembered gripping the edges of the casket as it was lowered into the earth. Everyone around him cried, but David's tears wouldn't fall. He felt hollow, stripped of something too essential to ever be restored. Rachel wasn't just his wife. She was his anchor, the one who steadied him when the world shook. And now she was gone in a fireball of twisted steel and broken glass. The police had told him it was a freak accident. Her car veered off the road late at night, flipped, and erupted in flames. By the time emergency responders arrived, the wreck was nothing more than charred metal. Instant death, they had said, as if those 2 words were supposed to soften the blow. The body, they claimed, was barely recognizable. All that remained was a burned gold bracelet David himself had given her on their 5th anniversary. That was enough for the coroner to close the file. David had stood at the grave, fists clenched, trying to believe that his life hadn't just ended. His best friend, Mark, was right there beside him. Mark had been his brother in all but blood since childhood, the kind of man who always showed up with a six-pack when times were tough. That day, he was more than a friend. He was David's only lifeline. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder, firm, grounding. "You're not alone, Dave," he whispered. His voice cracked, as though he, too, had lost someone irreplaceable. "I swear to you, I'll help you through this. Whatever it takes." For a moment, David leaned into that promise. His legs were trembling, his lungs raw from trying to breathe against the suffocating grief. Mark's presence was the only thing keeping him upright. Still, when the last clump of earth hit the coffin with a dull thud, David broke. He fell to his knees in the mud, the reality of it all crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His fingers clawed at the grass, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. And finally, the tears came, violent, wrenching sobs that left him gasping for air. "Why her?" he muttered, over and over. "Why Rachel? She was my everything. My everything." Mark knelt beside him, pulling him into an embrace. "She loved you, Dave, more than anything in this world. Don't forget that. Hold on to it." But holding on to her love felt like trying to catch smoke in his hands. Every day after the funeral was a battle. Waking up to an empty bed, walking past the closet that still smelled of her perfume, eating dinner alone at the kitchen table where laughter once filled the room. David kept going because there was no other choice. He buried himself in work, long hours at the construction firm, anything to quiet the hollow ache. At night, he'd sit on the back porch staring into the dark, clutching a glass of bourbon and wondering if life was worth living at all. Through it all, Mark never left. He checked in, dropped by, forced David out of the house when the walls threatened to swallow him whole. If not for Mark, David sometimes thought, he might have followed Rachel into the grave. To the outside world, it looked like David had begun to heal. But the truth was simpler, darker. He never really did. How do you heal when the love of your life is ripped away in a blaze of fire and smoke? 7 years ago, David Miller buried his wife. Or at least, he thought he did. What he couldn't have known then was that the funeral was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. 7 years can dull the sharpest pain, but for David Miller, grief had never truly faded. It had simply settled in his bones like a permanent ache, something he carried into every morning and every night. By 2023, David was 43 years old, his hair flecked with premature gray, his eyes lined from years of sleepless nights. He was steady in his career, working as a project manager at a construction firm in Cleveland. His colleagues respected him. He was dependable, detail-oriented, the kind of man who never complained. But outside the office, he was a ghost. He went home to a modest suburban house, cooked simple dinners for one, and fell asleep on a couch that still held the memory of Rachel's laughter. Friends had urged him to date again, to move on, to live. He nodded politely, but never tried. To love again felt like a betrayal of the woman buried beneath that headstone. And though he smiled when people asked how he was doing, the truth was he had been living on autopilot for years. The only person who could break through the fog was Mark. Mark had kept his promise after the funeral, staying close, dragging David out to bars or Sunday football games. Sometimes, late at night, David would admit he didn't know how he would have survived without him. Mark was his brother, his anchor, his last link to a world that felt like it had collapsed. Still, life had become routine, predictable, a long stretch of gray days bleeding into one another, until the day David's boss walked into his office with a grin. "Pack a bag, Miller. You've earned a break," his boss said, slapping a pair of plane tickets onto his desk. "Company's rewarding you with a week in the Bahamas. Sun, sand, maybe even a smile for once." David chuckled awkwardly, shaking his head. "I don't need a vacation. I've got plenty of work." "No arguments," the boss cut in. "You haven't taken a single personal day in 7 years. Go. Relax. Consider it mandatory." That night, David sat at his kitchen table staring at the tickets, a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand. The Bahamas, a paradise island where couples strolled the beaches and lovers toasted under the stars. It was the last place he wanted to be. What business did a widower have in paradise? And yet, something inside him whispered that maybe it was time. Maybe he owed it to himself to try, just once, to step outside the cage of grief he had built. So, reluctantly, David packed his bags. When he landed on the island, the heat hit him like a wave. The air smelled of salt and hibiscus, the sky impossibly blue. Tourists laughed as they wheeled suitcases down cobblestone paths toward pastel-colored resorts. David, in his plain button-down shirt and scuffed leather shoes, looked like a man out of place. He spent his first day walking along the beach, shoes in hand, letting the warm water lap at his ankles. For a brief moment, he felt lighter, as though the ocean itself was pulling the grief from his chest. That night, he sat on a balcony overlooking the sea, listening to the waves crash against the shore. For the first time in years, he thought, maybe I can breathe again. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. Just when David began to imagine life might still hold beauty, it prepared to show him a truth more devastating than the night of the funeral. Because somewhere on that island, beyond the turquoise waters and the postcard sunsets, Rachel was alive. And David was about to see her with his own eyes. The second morning in the Bahamas began like a dream. The sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. David walked barefoot along the shoreline, coffee in hand, the waves curling softly around his ankles. For a brief, fragile moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the trip was doing him some good. Then he saw her. At first, it was only a silhouette in the distance, tall, graceful, with dark hair that glistened under the sun. He stopped mid-step, squinting against the light. The way she tilted her head as she laughed, the curve of her shoulders, the sway of her hips, his chest constricted. It was impossible, absurd. His mind must have been playing cruel tricks. But as she turned, the world tilted on its axis. Rachel. The coffee slipped from his hand, splashing into the sand. His breath caught in his throat as his heart pounded violently against his ribs. She was alive. The woman he had buried, mourned, carried like a ghost in his soul. She was standing there, flesh and blood, no more than 30 feet away. David staggered backward, disoriented. 1,000 thoughts crashed through his head at once. It can't be her. She died. I buried her. I saw her bracelet in the ashes. And then he saw the man beside her. Mark, his best friend. The man who had held him up at the funeral. The man who had sworn to stay by his side. There he was, walking hand in hand with Rachel, their fingers intertwined as though they had been lovers all along. Rachel tilted her head toward him, laughing at something he said. Mark leaned closer, kissed her temple. David's stomach churned. He felt the air drain from his lungs, leaving him gasping. His knees nearly buckled beneath him. He wanted to scream, to run, to demand answers, but his body wouldn't move. All he could do was watch as the two people he had trusted most in this world strolled past him like strangers. Rachel, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the surf. Neither of them noticed him. His hands trembled as he fumbled for his phone. He snapped a photo, then another. His heart hammered as he zoomed in, the screen confirming what his mind still couldn't accept. It was Rachel. No doubt. No mistake. Her same soft brown eyes, the small scar near her chin, the way her hair curled in the salt air. And it was Mark. Broad shoulders, familiar gait, his unmistakable presence. David's chest ached as if his ribs were splintering inward. Memories assaulted him. The funeral, the grave, Mark's whispered promise. "You're not alone, Dave." Lies. All of it. He had spent 7 years grieving a ghost while they were sipping cocktails under palm trees. Panic and rage collided inside him. He trailed them at a distance, his sandals crunching against the boardwalk. His breath came in ragged gasps as he watched them browse souvenir shops, share a plate of conch fritters at a beachside cafe, lean in close as if they were the only two people in the world. David ducked behind a row of palm trees, sweat slicking his back despite the ocean breeze. He couldn't confront them, not yet. Not until he understood. He needed proof. He needed answers. They laughed together as they walked, Rachel's hand resting casually on Mark's chest. David's throat burned. Every touch between them was a dagger twisting deeper. The betrayal wasn't just about love. It was about friendship, loyalty, the sacred bond between brothers. He had trusted Mark with everything, and Mark had stolen the one person David couldn't live without. Hours later, back in his hotel room, David collapsed onto the bed, phone clutched in his hand. He scrolled through the photos again and again, hoping some detail would prove this was a mistake. But the more he stared, the clearer it became. Rachel hadn't died. Mark hadn't been grieving. They had been together, hiding, while David drowned alone in sorrow. A guttural cry tore from his chest. He slammed the phone onto the nightstand, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook as sobs racked his body, the kind of raw, desperate cries he hadn't allowed himself since the funeral. When the tears finally subsided, what remained was something far darker. Determination. If Rachel was alive, if Mark had betrayed him, then the last 7 years of his life had been built on lies. And David Miller was done being the fool in someone else's story. The next move would be his. Sleep didn't come that night. David lay in the dark of his hotel room, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily overhead, his mind racing like a runaway train. Every blink of his eyes replayed the image of Rachel's smile, Mark's hand wrapped around hers. The memories of the funeral, the grave, the endless nights of grief. All of it clashed violently with what he had seen on the beach. By dawn, exhaustion pressed heavy on his body, but there was no relief. He needed answers. Without them, he was drowning. That morning, he slipped into town, avoiding the crowded beaches and tourist traps. He found himself in a narrow office tucked between a liquor store and a pawn shop. A chipped wooden sign read, "Elliott and Associates, Private Investigations." Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. A wiry man in his 50s with sun-damaged skin looked up from behind a cluttered desk. "You lost something, mister?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. David hesitated, then pulled out his phone and laid it on the desk. On the screen was a photo, Rachel and Mark walking hand in hand. His hand trembled as he slid it forward. "I thought my wife died 7 years ago," David said, his voice low but steady. "Yesterday, I saw her alive. With my best friend." The man leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He studied the photo for a long moment before whistling softly. "That's one hell of a situation." He stuck out his hand. "Name's Elliott. If she's alive, I can find out why you were made to believe she wasn't." David shook his hand, his grip firm with desperation. "I need the truth. All of it. No matter how bad." 2 days later, Elliott returned with a manila folder bulging with papers. David met him in a quiet cafe off the beaten path. The investigator's eyes were heavy, as though what he had uncovered carried its own weight. "I did some digging," Elliott began, sliding the folder across the table. "Your wife, Rachel Miller, never died. The accident back in Ohio? It was staged." David froze. His pulse pounded in his ears as he flipped through the documents. There were grainy photos, copies of records, even a report from the fire marshal. Elliott continued. "The wrecked car they found, there was never a positive ID on the body. Coroner filed it as a presumed fatality. The bracelet used to confirm her identity? Turns out it could have been planted. No dental records, no DNA, nothing ironclad." David's throat went dry. "But the funeral, the ashes, the grave. An empty show," Elliott said bluntly. "Your wife disappeared the same night the car burned. And not alone. Records show she and your friend Mark withdrew large sums of cash in the weeks before. They purchased fake IDs, plane tickets. And here's the kicker. She collected on your life insurance policy. David looked up sharply. What? $500,000, Elliot said. Paid out under your name because you were the beneficiary. But guess who signed off on the claim? Pretending to be you? Mark. I tracked the money. It was routed through offshore accounts, then withdrawn over time. Classic insurance fraud. And they pulled it off because everyone believed she was dead. The cafe seemed to tilt around David. He gripped the table, knuckles white. His mind reeled with the scale of the betrayal. Rachel hadn't just left him, she had destroyed him. And Mark hadn't just stolen his wife. He had stolen his trust, his future, the very foundation of his life. David whispered, almost to himself, 7 years. I grieved a lie. Elliot leaned back, eyes narrowing. I've seen a lot of ugly schemes, Miller. But this one's cold. They left you to mourn, to rot in grief, while they sipped margaritas on white sand. I don't know what your next move is, but if it were me, I'd make them pay. That night, David returned to his hotel, folder pressed to his chest as though it contained the last pieces of his sanity. He laid the documents out across the bed, reading every line, every damning detail. His hands shook, his vision blurred with tears of fury. He thought of Rachel's cold laughter on the beach. I choose freedom, she had said, as though he was nothing more than a cage she'd escaped. He thought of Mark's silence, his cowardly refusal to even meet his eyes. For 7 years, David had lived like a man half dead. Now he knew why. He had been buried alive in their deception. The anger that rose inside him was different from grief. Grief crippled. Anger sharpened. It burned through his veins, hot and relentless, until all that was left was resolve. David swore to himself. He would confront them. He would drag the truth into the light. And whether justice came through the law or through his own hands, Rachel and Mark would pay for every day they had stolen from him. On the balcony, the ocean roared under the moonlight. David stood there, gripping the railing, his jaw tight, his heart heavy. But for the first time in 7 years, he wasn't powerless. The truth was his weapon now, and the reckoning was coming. The sun was sinking low on the horizon when David finally decided it was time. The documents lay spread across his hotel bed like a crime scene, but there was no more need to study them. He knew the truth. He had seen the proof with his own eyes, held it in his hands. Now, he needed to face the people who had destroyed him. He spent hours pacing the room, rehearsing words he wasn't sure he'd be able to say when the moment came. Anger throbbed in his chest, but beneath it was something worse, hurt. A wound that had never healed, ripped open all over again. As twilight settled over the island, he walked to the spot he knew they'd return to, a quiet stretch of beach near the palms, where tourists didn't bother to go. He had followed them enough over the past days to learn their patterns. They came here at sunset, always together, like a couple who believed the world had already forgiven them. David waited, his fists clenched, his pulse hammering. The ocean crashed at his back, the breeze carrying the tang of salt and the faint strum of steel drums from a distant bar. He almost turned away a dozen times, but each time Rachel's laugh echoed in his memory, pushing him forward. Then he saw them. Rachel and Mark walked along the shoreline, their bare feet sinking into the sand, their silhouettes framed by the dying light. They looked carefree, radiant, like lovers in a postcard. David felt his stomach twist. For 7 years he had mourned, and here they were, laughing, alive, untouched by guilt. He stepped forward. Rachel. Her name cut through the air like a blade. Rachel froze mid-step. She turned slowly, her smile fading as her eyes landed on him. For a moment, her face was pale, stunned, as though she'd seen a ghost. Mark stiffened, his arm tightening around her. David, he muttered, his voice caught between shock and dread. David took another step closer, his eyes locked on Rachel. 7 years, he said, his voice low, trembling with rage. 7 years I stood at your grave. 7 years I carried your death like a chain around my neck. And here you are, alive. Rachel's expression hardened, the fear melting into something colder. She tilted her chin, her lips curling into a faint, dismissive smile. You weren't supposed to find out, she said flatly. The words struck David like a slap. He staggered, disbelief crashing into him. That's all you have to say, he demanded. I buried you. I tore myself apart trying to survive without you. And you." He turned, pointing a shaking finger at Mark. "You swore to me you'd always be there. My brother. My best friend. And all this time, you were with her." Mark's jaw tightened. He couldn't meet David's eyes. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he muttered. Don't you dare," David snarled. His voice cracked, years of bottled grief spilling out. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You let me drown. You watched me waste away, and you stood there pretending to care." Rachel stepped forward then, her eyes sharp, her voice calm in a way that chilled him. "You need to understand, David. I loved the life you gave me, the security, the stability. But I never loved you. I wanted freedom. I wanted passion. Mark gave me that. And when we had the chance to walk away, to start over, we took it." Her words sliced through him. He could hardly breathe. "You could have left me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You could have told me the truth. But you chose to kill me in every way that mattered." Rachel's eyes glinted in the fading light. "We chose survival." For a long moment, the three of them stood there in silence, the surf crashing, gulls crying overhead. David's chest heaved, his fists shaking at his sides. He wanted to lunge, to break them both in half. But somewhere deep inside, another voice whispered, "Don't let them take more of you. Don't lose yourself to their betrayal." Finally, he drew a long, shuddering breath. "You think you've won," he said quietly, his gaze burning into them. "But your freedom is built on lies. And lies don't last." Rachel smirked. "Do what you want, David. No one will believe you. You're just a bitter widower clinging to ghosts." David's lips curved into a grim smile. "We'll see." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his heart pounding, the fire inside him no longer blind rage, but something sharper. Determination. Behind him, Rachel and Mark stood frozen, watching as the man they had buried once before disappeared into the darkness. For the first time, unease flickered in their eyes. Because David Miller wasn't broken anymore. He was awake, and the reckoning was only beginning. David walked away from the beach with his heart hammering, his hands still shaking from the confrontation. Every nerve in his body screamed for vengeance, raw, physical vengeance. He wanted to grab Mark by the throat, to make Rachel feel even a fraction of the pain she had inflicted. For a few terrifying moments, he imagined it vividly. But then another thought rose through the storm. That's what they'd expect. For me to lose control. For me to destroy myself. No, he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Back in his hotel room, David spread the manila folder across the bed once again. Photos, bank statements, insurance documents. Elliot had given him everything he needed. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was fraud. It was theft. It was a crime. And unlike grief, crimes had consequences. He picked up his phone, staring at it for a long time. His thumb hovered over Mark's contact, then Rachel's. He could call them, scream until his voice broke. But that would solve nothing. So instead, he dialed Elliot. The investigator answered on the second ring, voice groggy with sleep. "Miller, I've got what I need," David said, steady now. "It's time." The next morning, David walked into the local police station with the folder under his arm. He was surprised at how calm he felt. He wasn't a man chasing ghosts anymore. He was a man delivering proof. The officer at the front desk raised his brows as David set the file down. "I need to report a fraud," David said. "Insurance fraud. Identity fraud. And I have evidence." Within an hour, two detectives were combing through the documents. They flipped through offshore accounts, copies of signatures, false IDs. When they looked up at David, their eyes were sharp. "Mr. Miller, this is serious," one said. "If what you're telling us is true, your wife and your friend staged her death to cash out your policy. That's a felony. Multiple felonies." David nodded, jaw tight. They thought they buried the truth. They didn't bury me. The detectives assured him they'd take it from there. They asked him to stay available, to be ready for testimony. As David walked out of the station, the sun hit his face, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt something unfamiliar, control. 2 days later, justice arrived. It was late afternoon when the police stormed the beachfront hotel where Rachel and Mark had been staying. Tourists paused mid-drink as uniformed officers marched through the lobby. In their suite, Rachel and Mark barely had time to gather their passports before the door burst open. Rachel's shriek cut through the air as 2 officers pulled her wrists behind her back. Mark struggled, his face pale with shock, before he too was shoved against the wall and cuffed. David wasn't there, but he didn't need to be. He had already imagined the scene 100 times. Rachel's smug composure shattering, Mark's cowardice exposed. That evening, when the news broke, a headline flashing across the local broadcast about an Ohio woman and her accomplice arrested for staging a death and defrauding an insurance company. David sat alone on his balcony, listening to the waves. His phone buzzed. A text from Elliot. They're in custody. It's over. David exhaled, a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He hadn't raised a fist. He hadn't spilled blood. And yet, justice had come. But it wasn't triumph he felt. It was release. For 7 years, he had been chained to grief, haunted by a woman who pretended to be dead and a friend who pretended to care. Now, the chains had fallen away. He was still scarred, still raw, but free. On the horizon, the last light of day melted into the sea. David whispered to the wind, not to Rachel, not to Mark, but to himself. You're alive. You survived. And it's time to start living again. The morning after Rachel and Mark's arrest, the island felt different. The same waves lapped against the shore, the same gulls wheeled overhead, but to David it was as though the world had finally exhaled. For 7 long years, he had been living in a mausoleum built of lies. Now the walls had crumbled. He sat at a cafe overlooking the turquoise bay, sipping strong black coffee. The newspapers on the rack carried the story, Ohio woman and accomplice arrested in staged death scheme. The photo showed Rachel and Mark being led away in handcuffs. Rachel's face twisted in fury, Mark's bowed in shame. For a long time, David just stared at it. He felt no joy, no gloating triumph. Only closure. Justice, cold and steady, had done what rage could not. He thought back to the night of the funeral, to the promise he had made Rachel at her grave, that he would love her until his last breath. He had meant every word, and she had buried that love beneath layers of deceit. The Rachel he once adored had died long before the flames ever touched that car. And Mark, his brother, his anchor, had revealed himself as nothing more than a thief wearing friendship's mask. For years, David had leaned on him, confessed to him, grieved with him, never knowing every hug, every comforting word had been laced with betrayal. Yet as bitter as it was, David realized something else. He was still standing. He had endured the unendurable. He had walked through fire and come out scarred, but alive. That evening, he returned to the same stretch of beach where he had confronted them. The sun was setting again, casting the water in shades of gold and crimson. He dug his toes into the sand, letting the cool waves wash over his feet. For a moment, he closed his eyes and pictured Rachel as she once was, before the lies, before Mark. The way she used to laugh at his terrible jokes, the way she'd hum in the kitchen while cooking dinner, the way she fit against his chest when they danced in the living room. He let himself remember, not with anger, but with acceptance. Those memories were real once. But they belonged to another life, another man. Then he pictured the Rachel he had seen on the beach, smirking, dismissive, venom in her voice. That woman no longer had any power over him. She was gone now, caged by her own greed, and he was free. David whispered into the wind, "Goodbye, Rachel." The words surprised him with their weight. They weren't filled with venom or sorrow, but release. On his last night in the Bahamas, David wandered into a small bar tucked away from the tourist strip. The air buzzed with live music, laughter, and the clink of glasses. He sat at the counter, ordered a drink, and for the first time in years, felt the faint stirrings of possibility. The bartender, a cheerful woman with silver hair, leaned over and asked, "Vacation or escape?" David smiled, the kind of genuine smile that had been absent from his face for so long it felt foreign. "Maybe both," he answered. She chuckled. "Well, here's to starting over." She raised her glass, and David clinked his against it. Starting over. The words echoed in his chest. When he boarded the plane back to Ohio, David carried no suitcase heavier than his clothes. The real baggage, the grief, the betrayal, the lies, he left behind on that island. As the plane lifted into the sky, he looked out the window, watching the blue waters shrink into nothing more than a line on the horizon. 7 years ago, he had buried his wife. But only now, truly, was he burying the past. David Miller didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready, because the dead no longer haunted him. He was alive. And finally, he was free.